What if I told you the biggest band in the world hated each other so much they had to record their biggest album in 3 separate rooms? That the drummer and singer would get into bloody fistfights just minutes before walking on stage, and that the band's founder was finally kicked out of his own band and replaced by a machine. Here's how every little thing the police did wasn't magic.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
So Stuart Copeland was an American kid living in London, and he had a vision. His dad was a CIA agent, which might explain his aggressive take-charge personality. It was 1977, punk was exploding, and he wanted in. He saw this guy, Sting, real name Gordon Summer, a former school teacher from Newcastle, playing bass in a jazz fusion band called Last Exit. Sting had the look, the voice, and the talent. Stuart knew that this was his guy. He went up to him after a gig and basically begged him to start a punk band. Sting, bored with his jazz gigs and looking for a way out of teaching, finally said, yeah, sure. So he grabbed this guitarist, Corsican guitarist, Henry Padovani, and called themselves the Police. But they needed money, fast. So they took up a job for Wrigley's chewing gum commercial. The ad required them to have blonde hair. So they did. They got paid, bleached their hair, and the look stuck. It was a total punk rock sellout move before they even had a record. The problem was, they weren't very good. They were faking the punk thing, and it sounded thin. And then Andy Summers showed up. Andy was older. A lot older, 10 years older than his new bandmate. He was a real musician. He played with Zoot Money, The Animals, Kevin Ayers. He was a pro. He saw Sting and Stewart playing at a small London club, recognized the potential, but he also saw the problem. The other guitarist, Henry Padovani, could barely play. So Andy agreed to join the Police on one condition: kick Henry out. Sting and Stewart were like, not even blinking. Yeah, sure, he's out. Boom. Done. Dumped Henry, and the real Police was born. But from day one, there was a problem. Stuart Copeland was the founder. It was his band. He was loud, aggressive, and an absolute monster on the drums. Sting was the songwriter, quiet, intense, but had an ego the size of London. He was also, by his own admission, deeply arrogant. It was like putting 2 alpha wolves in a tiny cage and telling them to share. Andy, the veteran, was just there trying to keep the peace. And their manager was Stewart's brother, Miles Copeland. Miles was a shark. He ran a label called Illegal Records, if you could see the irony there. He didn't have any money, but he definitely had a plan. He got the Police a deal at A&M Records by basically lying, promising them a punk band. Got them a £10,000 advance, which the band saw as a fortune. They went into a tiny studio and banged out their first album, Outlandos d'Amor. One of these songs was a little reggae rock thing called Roxanne. Sting wrote it in Paris in October 1977 after seeing the prostitutes outside his cheap hotel. The label hated it. They thought it was weird, it wasn't punk, and the subject matter of it was a bit of a problem for their moral selves as well. They refused to release it as a single, but Miles took it to a radio station, personally bugged the DJ until he played it, and it exploded. Suddenly, Police were stars. And that's when the fighting really started. They were shoved into a tiny Ford Econoline van for their first American tour, driving themselves across the country, playing the tiny clubs. 3 of them crammed in together 24/7, and they brawled. We're not talking arguments here. We're talking about full-on bloody-knuckle fistfights. Sting and Stewart were the main event. They would literally tape a line down the middle of the van seat to divide their space. Stewart would make a comment about Sting's bass line. Sting, the former English teacher, would call him a Neanderthal. Stewart would throw a punch. They'd be rolling around on the floor of the van, trying to take each other out, with Andy Summers in the back just sighing, oh, for Christ's sake. They would tape fuck off on each other's gear. After one gig, Stewart got so mad at Sting, he dumped an entire plate of Indian curry over his head in a restaurant. So Sting, covered in his curry, tackled him, and they destroyed half the dining room. One night in Hamburg, they had a massive fight in the dressing room just before the show. It got so bad that Sting and Stewart were literally bloody. They walked on stage, not speaking, played the entire set just seething with rage. Second the lights went down, they went right back to fighting. Another time, on stage, Sting was in the middle of a song and turned around to taunt Stewart. Stewart, without missing a beat, stood up, hurled his drumsticks at Sting's head like javelins, and then sat back down and finished the song. Sting later admitted to breaking one of Stewart's ribs in a fight. Andy Summers later said that he spent most of his time with the band as a terrified mediator, trying to keep the 2 of them from actually truly taking one another out. And with every album, Regatta de Blanc, Zenyatta, Mondata, Ghost in the Machine, they got bigger, and the hate got deeper. The problem was money and control. Sting wrote all the songs, all of them. In the music business, the songwriter gets the publishing money. The other guys just get performance royalty. The difference is not thousands of dollars, it's millions of dollars. Sting set up his own publishing company, Steerpipe. He was getting damn rich. and he knew he held all the cards. If he walked, the band was done. If Stewart or Andy walked, Sting could replace them. And this power imbalance poisoned everything. Sting started seeing his bandmates as hired hands, and they started seeing him as an arrogant tyrant. By the time they recorded Ghost in the Machine in '81, they were already recording their parts separately. Sting brought in a sax player for multiple tracks without even telling the band, which of course pissed off Stewart in a big way. Started calling each other names. Sting was Adolf, Stewart was Benito, but in '83 it all came to a head. They were, without question, a freaking huge band. They went to the island of Montserrat, George Martin's idyllic air studios, to record their masterpiece, Synchronicity. By this time, they just could not stand the sight of each other, and so they didn't. They recorded the entire album in separate rooms. Stewart set up his drums in the studio's dining room. Andy was in the main tracking room with his guitars. Sting stayed in that control room, with producer Hugh Padgham like a king on his throne. He would send the tracks out to the other two, and they would send their parts back. It wasn't a band. It was a miserable high-tech construction project. Tension was so thick, Hugh said it was terrifying. One day, Sting was in the control room trying to lay down a bass part for every breath you take. He was being a perfectionist, doing it over and over 30, 40 times. Stewart from the dining room got on the talkback mic and said something like, "Are you going to play that damn thing, or are you just going to wank off all day?" To which, of course, Sting snapped, stormed out of the control room screaming, "At least I can write. What can you do?" And then he tackled Stewart. They tackled each other, rolling on the floor, punching and kicking. Padgham and the assistants had to physically pull them apart. Two grown men, millionaires by this time, covered in blood and sweat, trying to gouge at each other's eyes out. An hour later, they're back in their separate rooms, recording Every Breath You Take. Beautiful, haunting tune. And the song itself is a product of this dysfunction. Andy Summers came up with that signature guitar riff. It's the hook. Makes the song. He'd done it in one take. But because Sting wrote the lyrics and the chords, Sting got all the publishing. Andy got nothing but basically a thanks. The Synchronicity tour was massive. They played Shea Stadium to 70,000 people. They were kings. Right at the absolute peak, Sting pulled the plug. After their final show in Melbourne in March of 1984, he just left. Didn't have a big meeting, no announcement. He just told everybody he was taking a break. Then he called Stewart and Andy separately. He told them, "I'm done. This band is over." Stewart and Andy were stunned. Stewart in particular was totally blindsided. He still thought it was his band. Sting had other plans. He went and hired a quote-unquote serious band of all-star jazz musicians, guys like Branford Marsalis. He released The Dream of the Blue Turtles. It was a huge hit. Sting was now Sting, the serious artist, not just a pop star in a band anymore. He was an artiste, and he had no intention of ever going back. Stewart and Andy were just waiting. The phone never rang. Then in 1986, the phone finally rang. It was A&M Records, and they were panicking. The biggest cash cow, the Police, was gone. They needed a new album. Sting, busy with his newfound solo fame, refused, but the label pushed. They finally agreed on a compromise. They would release a greatest hits album, Every Breath You Take, the singles. But the label insisted that it had to have one new song, or at the very least, a new version of an old song. And the band, if you could even call them that, reluctantly agreed to get in the studio and re-record Don't Stand So Close to Me. From the first minute, it was a disaster. They met at a studio in North London. Sting walked in, not as the bass player, but as the superstar. The vibe was awful. Stewart and Andy were just the other two. Sting had a new toy. He was obsessed with the Fairlight CMI. It's a massive, expensive synthesizer and sampler. Totally revolutionary for the time. It could create drum sounds. It was the sound of the 80s. It was the sound of his solo album. And he decided that was what the Police should sound like. He didn't want Stewart's raw, energetic, popping human drumming. He wanted a cold, sterile machine. Stewart, of course, was totally insulted. This was his band, his sound. The Sting was trying to replace him with a button. And then fate handed Sting the perfect weapon. In the middle of this tense, awful week, Stewart was at Sting's country estate. He went to ride one of Sting's polo ponies, got thrown, and broke his collarbone. So he was out. He couldn't drum. For Sting, it's like, woohoo, this was a gift. His reaction was, reportedly, relief. He went to the producer and said, "Well, Stewart can't play. Guess we'll have to use the Fairlight." Stewart, of course, was horrified. He knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't being replaced because he was injured. He was being replaced because Sting wanted him replaced. Probably had the horse trained. Who knows? In a last desperate move, Stewart came in the studio, his arm in a sling, and tried to program the Fairlight himself, one-handed, just to have some part in it. He was trying to tap in the very drum patterns he had come up with, but it was no use. Sting and the producer took over. They programmed this cold, thin, lifeless drum track. And it sounds terrible. It has none of the power, none of the magic. It's the sound of a dying band. And Andy Summers was there watching this whole thing. He listened to the sterile track and was disgusted, calling his one-take overdub polishing a turd. Tried to add his signature guitar, but the magic was gone. The song was a limp, sterile 80s pop version of their classic hit. They all listened back to the final mix in silence. No celebration, no welcome back. They all just knew. This was it. Totally the end. Sting had finally won. He had erased his bandmates. They walked out of the studio and barely spoke again for 20 years. The new single was released and it flopped. The magic was gone, and the fans could hear it. Sting went back to his solo career. Stewart and Andy were left to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. The police were over, taken out not by a fight, but by a drum machine and an ego that couldn't be stopped. Years later, in 2007, they did reunite for one last tour. Why? The reason? Money. They're offered a staggering amount of it, rumored to be over $150 million. The hate was still there. If anything, it was worse. They traveled on separate buses, stayed on different hotel floors, flew in separate private jets, had separate entrances to the arenas, and would not see each other until the moment they walked on stage. Stewart started a blog on his website, and after one of the first shows, he wrote a scathing post calling Sting a petulant prima donna, mocking his onstage tantrums. Sting was so mad that he reportedly fined Stewart. Yes, so Stewart had to pay a fine. They finished the tour, which grossed over $360 million, collected their checks, and went their separate ways. This huge band was really just three guys who couldn't stand each other, who got stuck in a van for 10 years and accidentally made magic. I played a venue where Robert Plant had played years ago, and I was talking to the sound crew there. I said, could you tell me any stories about Robert Plant? I mean, that's awesome that he played there. It was a 3,000-seater, so not huge, but not tiny either. And he said that Robert Plant was the nicest guy ever, that he would come in and literally actually ask the crew if they needed anything. Just really warm and everything else. And as the day was going by, they were, setting up for a Robert show, and all of a sudden a Sting song came on because, they were playing the song. They had the songs playing during this time. And Robert Plant emerges from backstage, and he said, "You turn that off right now." So his sound crew was like, my God, here's Robert Plant. He's all nice and everything else. But the moment that Sting song came on, it was like he just changed. Like a switch just flipped. So if any of you know about the bad blood between Sting and Robert Plant, definitely leave it in the comment section. I'd be curious to see why Plant would just turn like that when the Sting song came on. Like, subscribe. To my subscribers, you frickin' rock. To my patrons, you frickin' rock. Thank you for watching.